Hi, and welcome to the Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast, a show about the moon and how astrologers embody and relate to it. My name is SP Hall, and I'm your host. You're hearing me from Los Angeles, California, unceded Quiche land, and it is 11:10 p.m. on November 24th, 2022, Pacific time. This is the introductory episode of the podcast, and on it, I hope to let you know all about what the podcast will be about, as well as introduce myself and talk about my astrological influences and how this project came to fruition. I am a student astrologer, and I want to get to know the moon better as someone with the moon in their first house as their luminary of Sect. So I have a particular fondness and appreciation for the moon. I hope to learn more about her by having conversations with astrologers about their lived experience, their embodiment, their relationship with the moon. I've called the podcast Luminaries In and Out of Sect because I will be focusing on the moon as a sect light and as the luminary out of Sect. I'll be releasing 2 episodes each astrological season. A conversation with someone that has the moon in that zodiacal sign as their luminary of Sect, their sect light, and one with an astrologer that has the moon in that zodiacal sign as their luminary out of Sect. Now, for those who don't know, let's touch briefly on what Sect means. So Sect in astrology is the idea of a distinction between charts of the day, of the diurnal, and charts of the night, the nocturnal. So people that are born at night are said to have a nocturnal chart. The moon rules that chart, so to speak, in a sense. The moon is the sect light of that chart. And for people born during the day, in diurnal charts, the sun is the sect light. So the sun is kind of a very important part of that day team. Sure, we'll talk about technical things such as lunar phase, such as sect, such as planetary aspects, about secondary progressions, a lot of fortune, zodiacal releasing, and go on and on. But I really want to focus on the experience of the planet, the embodiment of that planet, the relationship with that being. And I'm doing this with the hope of touching on the magical thread of the work of astrologers like Jason Hawley, Diana Rose Harper, and others doing relational astrology, like Aaron Tack Shipley and Pallas Augustine. Now, there are many other astrologers doing relational astrology. These are the astrologers who've had the most influence on me. So if I've forgotten anybody, my apologies. I'm just speaking from my experience. So I have 2 conversations lined up for Sagittarius season that I'm really excited about. As someone with a Sagittarius rising and a Sagittarius moon, I'm really excited for Sag season and to dive into this project of focusing on the moon. I believe the first episode will be with my friend, the astrologer Aaron Tack Shipley. So stay tuned in the next few weeks for the release of those conversations. So that will be the general gist of the podcast. I'm so excited to share it with you. Now, I want to take a moment to tell you a bit more about me, my astrological influences, and how this podcast came to be. First off, I want to give a shout out to the astrologer Sam Reynolds. I have been working as a podcast producer for the past 2.5 years, but I've mostly worked behind the scenes. I had a reading with Sam a few months ago, and after looking at my chart, he suggested that I be in front of the microphone hosting a podcast. Since then, I've been thinking about a podcast project that I'd be excited to work on. This year, well, over the past 6 months in particular, I've dived deep into studying astrology. Interestingly enough, that happened at my progressed new moon, which was also an eclipse. For those of you that don't know about secondary progressions, the astrology podcast has a really great breakdown of that concept, which I'll link in the show notes. But suffice it to say, the progressed new moon which can happen at different ages depending on your natal lunar phase, it's an important life point, potentially the start of a new chapter in one's life. Interestingly as well, I'm going through a ninth house perfection year. For those of you that don't know, annual perfections are a kind of symbolic timing technique in which each year your ascendant shifts one house. So there are 12 houses, and each year one of those houses are activated given your age. For those of you that don't know as well, the ninth house relates to astrology and higher education and travel, among other things. As I said, being a Sagittarius rising, my ninth house is Leo, which is ruled by the sun. I feel that this year I've been more aware of the Leo risings and the sun-ruled solar people in my life. I'm often amazed at their comfort to shine their light in the world. Well, I don't know if that's really how they feel about it, but that's what I've seen and what I've heard from them. This sun year for me has been about navigating visibility and sometimes being very fearful about letting myself shine. I mean, I originally came to the idea of this podcast about 3 months ago. I was really excited about the idea, but I put it on the proverbial shelf when I realized that I would actually have to do it. By that, I mean, I would actually have to let people see me, speak into this mic, and let people hear me. And that was frankly quite terrifying. But thanks to some very supportive people in my life, and showing up in therapy and being honest about what was going on for me, I was able to see that this was something that I really wanted to do, and that I deserved to shine. We all do. And I saw that I almost owed it to myself to at least try to do this. It's so hard for me. I've learned a lot about the solar this year, about letting myself shine, but I still have trouble with the sun. And despite that, it's been crucial for me to think astrologically so as to work through these issues. Maybe once I've gone through all of the moon signs, I'll move on to the sun signs. Maybe a year from now, I'll be ready to look more at the solar. I don't know. We'll see. So in addition to Sam Reynolds, I also wanted to thank Supersensory Shahir, my fellow Sagittarius rising, for inspiring me to finally commit to this project. They are doing really great work exploring Venus embodiment through the zodiacal signs. I've linked their YouTube in the show notes, so be sure to check out that series. Shahir inspired me to actually do this podcast by posting about their Venus embodiment series on Twitter. I was thinking, wow, I wanted to do a similar thing with the moon. Should I? Am I about to do this right now? And thankfully, they were very supportive and they urged me to do it. And I committed to doing it. I also want to say that I met Shahir via Ascendant Assemblies, which is a bi-monthly, that is to say every 2 months, meetup with people of the same rising sign. It's been really fun to talk about shared transits and check in on each other through them to offer some support. I'll also link Ascendant Assemblies in the show notes. My intense study of astrology this year really started in earnest with NORWAC 2022 in May. For those of you that don't know, NORWAC is the Northwest Astrology Conference, which happens annually, I believe, in Tukwila, Washington, which is just southeast of Seattle. One of the lectures at NORWAC that I found most impactful, embodied, alive, was Jason Hawley's lecture on the sun, interestingly enough. Since then, I've started studying with Jason, and in his classes, we explore myth, creativity, and embodied experiences of the planets to form a more relational astrology, an astrology that acknowledges and emphasizes the planets as beings, rather than merely abstract concepts or internal psychological structures. One of Jason's prompts that I find most empowering and exciting is this idea of reimagining and carrying on myth. The idea that living the myths and recreating them within and without us for our times has a transformative function psychologically, existentially, and spiritually. In addition to studying with Jason, I've also attended a number of lectures and workshops by Diana Rose Harper and have been deeply impacted by her emphasis on devotion in relationship with the planets and her work on planetary prayer. Her lecture that's been most impactful in relationship to the subject of this podcast is entitled Lamps in the Dark, the Radiance of the 12th House Luminaries, where she provides a guided experiential journey into the 12th house. For those of you that are not familiar with the 12th house, it's a Caden house, often called a dark house, as it's not in aspect with the ascendant, the rising sign. Because of that, the 12th house is often called bad. But Diana offers a more nuanced perspective in her lecture, one rooted in living with 12th house luminaries. We'll be talking more about the 12th house in our next episode. My experience with the work of these two astrologers in particular led me to this desire to focus this podcast on the embodied, relational experience of astrology. My thoughts on why it's important to focus on the moon in astrology, the moon's central importance to this art, have been really influenced by the work of Ali A. Olomi. Seriously, becoming a patron of Ali's on Patreon is some of the best money I've ever spent in terms of astrological education. The man is a literal font of knowledge concerning history and astrology. I've also put a link to his Patreon in the show notes, and I highly recommend becoming a part of the community he's building there. We often talk about the moon as reflecting the light of the sun, being dependent on the sun. But in his recent episode on the moon in medieval astrology, he points out that medieval astrologers and thinkers believed that the moon also gave off its own heat and light. He says, and I think this is really beautiful, that the moon, and I suppose this is given its proximity to the Earth relative to the other planets, which is called the Chaldean order, he says, quote, gathers the light of other planets and transmits it onto the Earth. No influence can be felt on Earth except by the grace of the moon. I love that keyword for the moon, grace. It reminds me of the associations we make between the moon and the body. Given the swiftness of the moon, and therefore its associations with movement, it's fitting that we would rely on the moon's grace. For where do we ascribe grace to a person, but in something about the beauty of their embodiment? The grace, the delicacy, or intentionality of their movement. He speaks to the placement of the moon in natal charts as, quote, the most important point. Beyond the sun, and regardless of sect, he speaks to the moon and the techniques associated with it as revealing both the nature of the soul and the nature of the person. But I don't want to keep paraphrasing and quoting Ali. Definitely go listen to that so that you can hear it directly from him, because he has an amazing way of explaining it himself. With that said, I don't want this podcast to be about controversy, about a feud between the solar and the lunar. Both have their place, of course. And as a very lunar person, I can appreciate that. At night, because the sun is under the horizon, we see the moon shine, and the moon's light, rather than blocking the other lights out, creates space for us to see the light of all these other beings. And we come to see how important all of their light is. Astrology is this highly contextual thing. It's not just about your sun sign or your moon sign, or the relationship of your sun sign and your moon sign, or the placement of your other planets. It's about the relationship of all those things to each other and the context in which they find themselves. So this is not about saying one thing is better than the other. It's just that I love the moon, and I have the moon in my first house, and I'm a very lunar person. And as a student of astrology, I want to focus on learning more about the moon and how people experience that. And before I go, I wanted to leave you with a recitation of the Orphic hymn to Selene, one of the goddesses associated with the moon. This is by Sarah Leanne Mastros from her Orphic Hymns Grimoire. Thanks again for giving me permission to read this hymn on the podcast, Sarah. I spoke to her via email today, and she wanted me to let you know that the second edition of this book was released recently. I've put a link to that in the show notes as well. Hear us, holy goddess, night-shining queen, Selene, light-bringer of radiant gleam, cow-horned moon, racing through the night, nocturnal torch-bearing maiden of light, waxing and waning, male and female combined, luminous silver-rayed, mother of time. You love running horses, O fruitful deliverer, joy-giving, deep-hearted, big bliss distributor, whose warm glowing orb illumines the night, all-seeing, ever vigilant, beautiful, bright. Full to bursting with stars, O pregnant moon. Your warm glowing orb reflects the light of high noon. The rich, quiet black is your eternal delight. You grant favor and luck, shining jewel of the night. Marshal of the stars, purple cloaked, silver veiled, lux lustrous initiatrix, queen of the night, hail. O maiden, bright moon, accept your initiate's praise, and shine on our sanctum with your all-blessing rays. Thanks for listening to the show. I'll see you next time. To find a transcript of this episode, please subscribe to my Substack, which is linked in the show notes. And please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcast or Spotify. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. See those links in the show notes as well. Please feel free to follow me there and let me know that you found me from listening to the show. If you have any questions or feedback on the show, please feel free to email me at sphallhorary@gmail.com. In the show notes, you can also find links to the websites of the astrologers and other resources that I mentioned in this episode, as well as links to the cover art and the intro and outro music. Thanks. See you next time.